Hello, everyone, and welcome to At America TV. My name is James from the e-guides here at America, and we welcome audience members joining us online. We hope that you guys are doing well and staying safe. At America is the United States Embassy's American Center, and our mission is to provide a space for young Indonesians to learn more about the United States. In this episode, we will be having Knowledge at America, Democracy as Government, Success or Failure. But before we begin, let's break the ice with a little game. I have here a question for everybody. Which civilization of the ancient world first created democracy? Is it Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, or Rome? Stay tuned until the end of this program because we'll be giving a live shout out to whoever can answer correctly on our social medias. I'd also like to let everyone know that to celebrate an America's 10th year anniversary and the National Hispanic Heritage Month, we are handing out Apple AirPods to 3 lucky participants. Stay tuned until the end of this program if you want to find out how to get them. Other than that, don't forget to take a selfie and tag at America's Instagram account. And now, without further ado, I would like to invite Pak Mark Neighbors, a political officer from the US Embassy Jakarta, to give his video remarks.
Selamat sore. Nama saya Mark Neighbors dan saya pejabat politik di Kedutaan Besar Amerika Serikat di Jakarta. Terima kasih atas kesempatan untuk berbicara dengan Anda malam ini. Juga terima kasih yang sebesar-besarnya kepada At America kerana telah menjadi tuan rumah acara yang luar biasa ini. Dan terima kasih yang sebesar-besarnya kepada panelis kami yang terhormat dan kepada anda para penonton yang telah mendengarkan kami. Tidak ada keraguan bahawa demokrasi saat ini menghadapi banyak tantangan serius. Krisis iklim, pandemi, kebangkitan populisme dan nasionalisme, dan efek beracun dari misinformasi dan disinformasi, terutama di media sosial, membantu melukiskan gambaran suram tentang masa depan kita. Namun, saya masih punya harapan. Dulu, mantan Presiden Bill Clinton berkata, "There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be fixed by what is right with America." Saya akan mengambil pernyataan itu selangkah lebih maju dan berkata, "There is nothing wrong with democracy that cannot be fixed by what is right with democracy." Misalnya, dengan perubahan iklim, beberapa orang mengatakan demokrasi terlalu berantakan. Negara-negara demokratis tidak dapat bergerak cukup cepat untuk menangani perubahan menakutkan yang disebabkan oleh pemanasan global. Namun, kita telah melihat betapa banyak inovasi yang datang dari akar rumput di negara kita. Para inovator itulah yang akan membantu menyelamatkan planet ini. Dengan adanya pandemi, kita telah melihat bagaimana kerjasama antara ilmuwan, perusahaan swasta dan pemerintah menciptakan vaksin yang efektif dan aman dalam waktu kurang dari setahun. Dengan data yang tersedia untuk umum bagi siapa saja yang tertarik untuk membaca. Akhirnya, dengan kebangkitan ideologi anti-demokrasi dan penyebaran disinformasi, alat yang sama yang digunakan untuk menyebarkan kebencian dan mempromosikan hoax dan teori konspirasi dapat digunakan untuk menyatukan orang, untuk belajar, bekerja sama, untuk menginspirasi. Sebelum saya mengakhiri sambutan saya hari ini, saya harus mengklarifikasi bahawa meskipun saya masih optimis, saya tahu untuk mengamankan masa depan kami masih memiliki banyak pekerjaan yang harus dilakukan. Tidak ada solusi untuk tantangan yang kita hadapi yang mudah. Namun, saya tahu bahawa kerana kekuatan negara demokratis ada pada wajarnya warganya, saya yakin bahwa jalan untuk mengatasi banyak tantangan kita juga ada di tangan Anda dan saya bersama kita semua. Sekali lagi terima kasih atas kesempatan ini untuk berbicara dengan Anda semua.
And now I would like to invite Mas Bima Jonanda, our moderator for today, and a junior lecturer for international relations at the Universitas Andalas. Mas Bima, the stage is yours.
All right. Thank you, James. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our event today, discussing democracy as government, success or failure, presented by At America, the American Culture Center under the United States Embassy in Jakarta. What is the state of democracy in the world today? Democracy is literally ruled by the people, where the main principle of democracy is rule of law, freedom of press, respect of human rights, active political process, and enlightenment citizens. New research by Courthouse News shows that democratic qualities are declining in 24 states, representing about 1/3 of the global population. For the first time since 1979, the number of countries facing decline of democracy matched the number of countries advancing democratic qualities. This sparked many interesting questions, and we will discuss this together with our two speakers that already joined with us, which is Mr. Terry Anderson and Mr. Abu Bakar Ebihara. Now, for our first speaker for today's event is Mr. Terry Anderson. Mr. Terry Anderson is a professor of history and a cornerstone faculty fellow who has taught in Malaysia and Japan. He has received Fulbright Awards to China and Indonesia and was the Mary Ball Washington Professor of American History at University College, Dublin. He is the author of numerous articles of the 1960s and the Vietnam War, co-author of A Flying Tiger's Diary, and author of the 60s, United States, Great Britain, and the Cold War. And his latest book was A Bush Wars. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let us invite our first speaker today, Mr. Terry Anderson. Hello, Terry. Hello, Terry.
Hello, hi.
Hey, right.
I unmuted it.
Well, good evening, Jakarta time. I believe that is good morning at your side, right?
It is good morning for me.
All right, Terry. So yes, democracy. This will be spark many interesting questions. I think we believe we will have a very great discussion today. So let us begin, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are we're looking pretty good here?
Yes, it's looking good from my side, Terry.
Okay, great. Okay, first I want to say thank you so much at America for inviting me. I have been with your program one time before, and it was when I was a Fulbright. And I want to briefly mention where I was. I was at this wonderful place, this tremendous university, Gajah Mada, and I spent 5 of my happiest months there. It was tremendous teaching American studies to the students, and I even got my students to laugh, as you can see. It was not that difficult, but we had a wonderful time, and my students really liked it when I took them to lunch. They enjoyed this so much, and my wife joins us here, and we're going to lunch, and we had a great time for 5 months in Georgia. It was great, really a fun time. But now to get to the main topic. Winston Churchill, the great Prime Minister of Great Britain, said, "Many forms of government have been tried. Democracy is the worst form of government," he said, "except for all those other forms." 200 years before that, the founding fathers of America were at Independence Hall. They had just finished writing the US Constitution. And when they left, a man asked Benjamin Franklin, one of our founding fathers, what kind of government do we have? And he said, a democratic republic, if you can keep it. Indeed, as the founding fathers knew, democracy is a constant struggle. And my nation was involved in that struggle this January 6th. This January 6th, a day that will go down in history like other great days in American history. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. The assassination of President Kennedy, November 22nd, 63. And of course, a day that we just remembered 20 years ago, September 11th, 2001. These were all days that changed American history. January 6th, Donald Trump, who had been beaten in the November election, now urged his followers, a bunch of vigilantes, to march down to the Capitol and stop the certification of the election. Previously, a few days before, he had called on his acting attorney general and told him to say the election was corrupt. In fact, when Republican and Democrat Secretary of States in all 50 states had declared that this election was the most secure in American history. There was no voter fraud in any state. And then later, the president attempted to rewrite history and say that this wasn't a bunch of vigilantes. No, this was a love fest, he called it, a love fest between his supporters and the police, when in fact, 6 policemen were injured and 1 died of a heart attack. It was U.S. Representative, a Republican by the name of Lynn Cheney, who asked the big questions in the House of Representatives. Will we adhere to the rule of law? Will we respect the rules of the courts? Will we preserve the peaceful transfer of power? Do we hate our political opponents more than we love our Constitution and our country? January 6th was the latest demonstration of how fragile democracy can be, even in the oldest continuing democracy on earth. Democracy is a constant struggle. There are many examples to demonstrate that American democracy has been under attack for 200 years. And one of them was written right into the Constitution itself, and that is the Electoral College. You might think in a great democracy that the people's will would count, that it should be the popular vote that elects the president. The person who gets the most votes should win. But in fact, the founding fathers themselves were a little fearful of that. They were fearful, and consequently, they established something called the Electoral College. The person who wins the Electoral College, not the popular vote, wins American elections. Now, we have had 45 presidential elections, 45, and 5 of those have been decided not by the popular vote, but by the Electoral College. The most recent is the year 2000. Democrat Gore won 500,000 votes more than George W. Bush. But George W. Bush won the Electoral College barely and became president of the United States. And a more recent example is 2016. Look at this. Hillary Clinton wins 2 million 2 million more votes than Donald Trump. 1.5% more. But Trump wins the electoral vote. So he becomes president of the United States. To put this into perspective, one of our most famous presidents, John Kennedy, he only won the popular vote by 112,000 votes. Hillary won by over 2 million. John Kennedy became president. Hillary did not. It is a skewed, undemocratic system. Secondly, there is another attack on American democracy, and that was named after Elbridge Gerry. He was the 5th vice president of the United States, and we call it gerrymandering. The United States has 435 congressional seats in the House of Representatives. 435, not any more, not any less. It's been set at 435. Okay, so how do you pick who gets elected from a state? What they do, both parties, is after every census, every 10 years, we're in the process right now because of the census of 2020, you redraw the congressional lines. And the perfect example, there's many examples, but one of the perfect ones is the 4th District of Ohio. Look at this. Why is it drawn like this? Because it leaves the cities out. Okay, most of this is farmland, and most of the farmers vote conservative. They vote Republican, okay? And most people who live in the cities vote Democrat. So you get skewed, ugly, gerrymandered districts like the 4th of Ohio. And it's not just that one. Because they have a Republican governor and because they have a Republican legislature, what you get is all kinds of very strange looking areas. And you might think that a state that votes about 50% Democrat and about 50% Republican would have half Republican representatives and half Democrat representatives. But because of gerrymandering, Ohio, who has 16 Congress people, 16 go to Congress. Because of gerrymandering, 12 are Republican and 4 are Democrat. 12 Republicans, they vote about 50-50. That's not democracy. That's called gerrymandering. Now, what is going to happen with those 435? Because of the census, we see that 2 states' population have grown, and they're going to each pick up 1 more seat in Congress. Those 2 states are Texas and Florida. And who is going to lose Congress people? The 2 states that lost population, New York and California. They are going to be losing. There is another very undemocratic aspect, and that is called the Senate filibuster. The Senate filibuster was devised not by the founding fathers, but by senators themselves. Okay? They came up with the idea of the filibuster. Why? What is a filibuster? It means that you need a super majority to pass anything in the Senate. It means in order to take legislation and move it forward in the legislative process and vote on it, you need 60 votes. Our Senate has 100 senators. Why not 51? They wanted to slow the process down. Why? For the most part, it was to stop civil rights legislation. And the most famous filibuster ever was for almost 60 days, and it was the Southern senators trying to stop the 1964 Civil Rights Act. They were trying to stop it almost for 60 days. They talked and talked and talked 24 hours a day until the great civil rights president, Texas Democrat Lyndon Baines Johnson, passed perhaps the most important law of the 20th century, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which ended segregation in the South and gave African Americans basically their civil rights and then their voting rights. And you can see Martin Luther King is invited to the White House and shakes his hand and gets one of the pens that LBJ signed with on the Civil Rights Act. So the Civil Rights Act. Finally, there is something else that is an impediment to American democracy, and that is the states themselves. We have a system in America in which the states claim that they have rights. Actually, that was pretty much ended by the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which was signed after the Civil War. Okay, what does that mean? It means that all citizens in America, regardless of what state you live in, have due process of law. In other words, I have the same equal rights. I have the same civil rights as somebody who lives in California or Florida, New York, whatever. We all have the same due process of law. That is the 14th Amendment. States' rights, what do states do? Usually, states pass laws that discriminate against some people in their society. One of the most famous was a law that said in 15 states, that if you are a white, you cannot marry somebody of another race. This went all the way back to 1640, when Virginia passed a law, when it was a colony, that white men cannot marry black slaves or black people, even if they were freed. In other words, 15 states had laws that said interracial marriage is banned. And this went to the Supreme Court in 1967 because these two people, this man in Virginia, white man, and his black girlfriend, couldn't get married in Virginia. No, they had to go to Washington, D.C., where they did get married, and then they came back home to Virginia and they were arrested. This went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and as you can see, it was a 9-0 decision. Do you realize that that meant that white could not marry Asians too in many states? My younger brother is married to a woman from Thailand. He couldn't, if he lived in Virginia, get married there. So this was found unconstitutional. State discrimination continues. After this election, Trump continued the big lie that he won. And therefore, a lot of Republicans in 18 states passed 30 different laws restricting voting rights. Now, you might think the great democracy would want to increase voting rights. No, it's always a game between states and their population. Now, there are a number of other questions. Does exporting American democracy work? Does exporting American democracy? Well, it did work very well. And there are two examples of how it worked very well. One was Germany, and the other was Japan. First, Germany and Japan suffered total defeat in 1945 at the end of World War II. The United States Army occupied them for 6 or 7 years. The United States still has military bases in Germany and in Japan. Furthermore, the United States wrote the Constitution. Yeah, and the Japanese are still using the Constitution that we wrote for them. So are the Germans, in a sense. Another thing is it worked because these are unified societies. very unified society. And finally, it worked because the United States came in with massive aid and massive trade to get those defeated countries back on their feet and grow strong economies. However, there are more examples in which exporting democracy does not work. Certainly did not work in Vietnam. Vietnam is basically in a civil war, and the United States gets involved in that. And it certainly did not work in Iraq or in Afghanistan, the graveyard of empire. George Bush, his misguided invasion of Iraq in 2003, what did that mean? Well, it meant that the United States basically got involved in and created a civil war in Iraq. So it didn't work there. Furthermore, Afghanistan, it didn't work there either, as we just have seen the last Americans leave that country. Why didn't it work? It didn't work because those nations were basically either in a civil war or because the British created these nations, Iraq and Afghanistan. Iraq has 3 different types of people, and Afghanistan has 5 different ethnic groups. They have been fighting for centuries. So for America to come in with our Christian army and tell these people how to behave, well, it's a fool's errand to begin with. Another question is, can American help struggling democracy? Can we help? And the best example of yes is Argentina. During the 1970s, Argentina had the dirty war. In other words, their military junta, their military dictatorship was taking college students and they disappeared. They killed 30,000 of them. The United States, under Jimmy Carter, declared human rights, cut off their aid, told them to quit, really put a lot of pressure on them, and their military junta failed, and they eventually became a much more democratic nation. So American can have a positive impact. What are the foundational values of democracy? First, rule of law. Every citizen must be treated the same, preferably under a written constitution with fair and impartial judicial system. How do you characterize the status of democracy around the world? It's fluid. Democracy always is fluid. If you take a look at something called the World Democratic Index, last done in 2020, it measures the electoral process, it measures democracy, the functioning of government, popular culture, civil liberties. What countries are the most democratic in the world? Norway, Iceland, Sweden, New Zealand, Finland, Ireland, Canada, Denmark, Australia. Number 10 is Switzerland. Germany, 13. Britain, 14. The USA, 25. Japan, 23. Indonesia, 52. 52. It's always changing. And of course, this last was done in 2020. Trump was still our president. We were going down on the Democratic Index. In cases where democracy declines, what are the factors? The rise of a strong man, eager to maintain power for any reason at all. We can certainly see this in Trump's America. We can see this in Bolsonaro's Brazil and Viktor Orban's Hungary. Demise of freedom of the press. As the Washington Post slogan says, democracies die in darkness. In fact, what happens when a strong man sees the press and doesn't like it? He calls it fake news. Doesn't make any difference who this person is. It's always fake news. In other words, the job of a free press is to continue to tell the people of the country that many of the strong men's claims are baseless or without evidence. In what cases do democracy emerge or are strengthened? What factors do we need? Free and fair elections, a strong judiciary that the American or any people trust, and the ability for people to speak out and protest peacefully. And finally, is there one kind of democracy for all people of the world? No. Democracies reflect the people, reflect their values, reflect their beliefs. American democracy is very, very different from Japanese democracy or Indonesian democracy. Most of the strongest types of democracy are in countries with the most united society, the most united culture. In summary, let me again say what the founding fathers very well understood, and that is democracy is a constant struggle. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Terry. What a great presentation. There is so many information that we gather from your presentation, especially that a good democracy is a democracy where free and fair election is happen. And what is a good democracy? Well, democracy is good for people that have the most united people in those countries. Very interesting insight, but for those of the participants who want to ask a question, we will begin our second presentation by our second speaker. So after that, we will begin our Q&A session. For our second speaker for this pleasant evening is Mr. Abu Bakar Ebihara. Mr. Abu Bakar Ebihara is a senior lecturer at the Department of International Relations, University of Jember, Universitas Jember, Indonesia. He was a Fulbright U.S. ASEAN visiting scholar in 2015 at the School of International Studies, American University. He completed his Master of Arts and PhD from the Research School, Pacific and ASEAN Studies at Australian National University, Canberra in 2000. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Mr. Abu Bakar Ebihara. Pak Abu Bakar, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
All right, you can begin your presentation. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, for Terry Anderson.
Thank you.
It's a great honor for me to participate in these seminars, in particular because I'm in panels with Professor Anderson. And I would like to thank that America for inviting me to talk about Indonesian democracy. So I try to follow the guidelines that have been given by the committee to speak about Indonesian experience with democracy. And the title of my presentation is the contestation for democracy in the world and in Indonesia. So, and the question that I want to discuss today is about whether it is true that democracy is in the world is in crisis, and what about in Indonesia? So it is an easy answer actually, because everybody talk about the crisis of democracy, the decreasing or the declining of democracy, as we also heard from Anderson. There's been a report in Freedom House on economic units that the democracy all over the world is in decrease. And also it happened in Indonesia. But so the simple explanation or the simple answer is yes. But I think what I'm going to talk this morning, this evening, The problem, I think, is not as simple as that, because Indonesia, for example, has tried to adopt democracy for a long time since independence. So there is a very, very long process, and this process has to be discussed. I think I want to discuss about this process. And as we know, democracy, I think, from many perspectives, from many writers, they start from a kind of a very clear definition and principle of democracy. The Freedom House, for example, and economic units, for example, they have a very clear criteria, very clear measurements for democracy. So later on, we can see that it's easy for them to measure whether this country is a democracy or not, and also they can measure the level of freedom, level of democracy in many countries all over the world. And we know that actually, as also I think been mentioned by Prof. Anderson's, democracy is the kind of foreign ideas, I think, for countries like Indonesia. It is exported by Western countries to Indonesia. And it is, I think, exported together with the concept of nation-state system. Actually, before, when democracy came to Indonesia, democracy values spread over by the so-called non-entrepreneurs of democracy. Many people said that there are three thinkings with regard to democracy. The first one is that yes, actually, we have our own democratic values. We have our tradition of democracy as principle of deliberation, for example. And also, there's another thinking that Indonesia has values that are compatible with democracy. They mentioned that Islam, for example, is compatible with democracy. And also, there are those who reject democracy, but not many people. But nowadays, I think certain group of people in Indonesia, they totally reject democracy. So it is in this kind of condition when democracy entered Indonesia. And so far, many academics talk and have a kind of standard, as I mentioned before. The studies of democracy so far mention about democracy regression, for example, democracy regressions. The main expert of democracy, Professor O'Reilly Diamonds, for example, discuss about this and many other scholars as well discuss about democracy regressions. So in the Indonesian context, for example, we have so many terms with regard to the declining of democracy. So as you can see here, for example, Prof. Misner talk about defective democracy in Indonesia. Professor Hadis mentioned about democratic setbacks, and then democratic regression, according to Aspinall, democratic deconsolidation, democratic declines. So there are many terms to mention the declining democracy in Indonesia. I think they are very disappointed with the progress of democracy in Indonesia, in particular after they expect that after Suharto fall down, they really expect that Indonesia will be a kind of a champion of democracy and become an examples. But unfortunately, that this not really happened. So that's why they wrote a lot of articles regarding problem with Indonesian democracy. So I don't want to argue against these arguments because, as I mentioned, they have fixed measures of democracy. and they are talking about process of democratization, a linear process of democratization. So they have the concept like democratic transitions. There are steps from transition, then you can have a consolidation. If the one country doesn't go in this direction, then they may call it democratic deconsolidation. So they are kind of backward from this process. And also they talk about freedom from free to half free, for example. So it is a kind of common and popular explanation with regard to Indonesian democracy. And also, so I think I'll leave this one. So, but in my opinion, the explanations for democracy in Indonesia, we need to see it is not as simple as that Indonesian democracy is decreasing or something like that. But we need to see that there has been an aspect of acceptance and contestation with regard to the ideas of democracy itself among Indonesians. So, and it has happened for quite long times. A certain aspect of democratic values, I think, has been well received. For example, the principle of law enforcement, anti-oligarchy, anti-corruption, and transparency. So all of these principles has been well received, but several other values are still debatable, such as principle of civil liberties, separation of the military from politics, and then institutional rules such as elections. There's been a kind of debate and discussion among third countries, and including Indonesia, with regard to these values. So some countries like China, for example, Afghanistan, Iran, even Singapore, they didn't fully accept the liberal democracy. They said that they have their own context and needs, so they adjust certain principle of democracy and they limit a certain freedom. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we can see that in Indonesia, from period to period, the principle of democracy has been debated and contested. And after the independence, the proclamation of independence in 1945, Indonesia, I think, straight away adopts liberal democracy. They changed the system into a parliamentary system, I think, during Prime Minister Hatta government in 1945. And this is a strategic decision, I think, because Indonesia at the time need recognition for its independence. They want to show to the world that they are democratic countries. And there has been, as been discussed by many people, there's going to be a lot of problem with the parliamentary system during that times until 1959, in particular because they couldn't decide the foundation of Indonesia politics, whether we should follow Islamic principle or Pancasila principle. And the system ended with the decree from Sukarno in 1955. So Sukarno at the time disbanded the parliament, and he then replaced Indonesia with so-called guided democracy. And he clearly rejected the so-called liberal democracy. So we can see that there has been a lot of discussion, a lot of debate regarding what kind of democracy we should implement. So in other words, the ideas of liberal democracy has been contested during Indonesian history. And Suharto also, I think, tried to develop its own style of democracy. It's adopts certain aspect of modern democracy or liberal democracy, but it also developed its own style of democracy. And this happened until, I think, in 1998, I think, when Suharto fall down because of the democratic pressure, reform movements at the time. And then at the times, Indonesia tried to fully, I think, implement the principle of liberal democracy at the time by changing the political system, by replacing amending the constitutions and installing a lot of democratic institutions at the times. And a lot of people are very happy, and they talk about compatibility of Islam and democracy, for example. But I think that's not the end of history. So we follow the book written by Francis Fukuyama. He talk about the end of the story because of the triumphs of liberal democracy. But in Indonesia context, it's not the end of history because they just start to actually to adopt the liberal democracy. So, and it is not a total acceptance, as I mentioned. There has been a negotiation process. There has been a lot of discussion regarding the system, the election system, and in general, it was not a fully implemented so-called liberal democracy. And also, there has been another problems at this time. I think because we in the past we can see that a lot of support, I think, from Western countries with regard to democracy. But recently, because Western states, as mentioned also by Paul Anderson, has also its own problem with democracy, and there is a bit reluctant for Western state, I think, to discuss or to support democracy in all over the world. So we can see here that it is not about the end of history. We can see that as there has been a different definition, I think, with regard to the democracy among Indonesian elites. Some people mention that it is not substantial democracy. For example, what we have is a kind of electoral democracy, because democracy only happened during the election, and it is only used to change the governments, and also what is being done is not to form a good government actually, but to struggle for power and to consolidate power that has been feel uncompleted. So when you win the election, sometimes they don't use the power to rule or to make a good government, but what they are doing is only to increase the power. So in Indonesia, the level of acceptance of democracy, ideas, and Islam is very fluctuating. Perhaps now they just understand democracy in the surface. So unlike some other countries, power and legitimacy is not maintained through achievements that convince the people, but it is defended by silencing potential opposition, by using social media and other means, by weakening anti-corruption bodies, for example, and embracing their own friends and family in the government, and they try to ensure the large coalition in the government. So instead of showing to the people they are doing a good job, they are fulfilling the people's needs. So the government builds the legitimacy, maintain the power by using this kind of strategy, by increasing the power, by limiting the opposition. So this is the way I think the government understands democracy. So it is not they have the power, then the power is used to work for the people. Actually, by working for the people, so their legitimacy will increase actually. But instead of concentrating on doing that, what the government is doing is that they try to increase the power. They try to silence the opposition. So I come to the last part of my presentation. As I mentioned earlier, so we can see now that the struggle to support democracy is mainly rely on the local entrepreneurs of democracy, local actors, local activists, and because the support from Western society is decreasing, as I mentioned earlier. So they have to choose their own strategy. They have to struggle how to maintain freedom, for example, how to cope with the pressure from the government. So this is because there's not really a global support anymore to democracy. And also, the spread of democracy is more complicated now. It's more problematic now due to the rise of a non-democratic but economically vibrant China. So now America is not only the reference for progress and democracy because of the rise of China. So a lot of third world countries, for example, see China as a model for economy. So there are a lot of cooperation with China. And so we can see here, probably we can discuss about this later, that there's been decline of US hegemony, not only in the economy, but also in the establishment of democracy. And as mentioned earlier, the US and Western countries are no longer as enthusiastic as before, as they used to be in democratic constitution, in promoting democracy. So countries that have just adopted democracy must therefore rely more on Democrats who grew up in the long process of spreading democracy. So they have to rely on their own and on the Democrats. I think they now cannot much depend on the Western support anymore. So I think that's my presentation. Thank you for your kind attention. I give back the floor to the moderator. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Abu Bakar Ebihara. A very nice presentation, a very insightful presentation, especially that you focusing on Indonesia, that in Indonesia, democracy is adopted, but not fully accepted. And the other side of the story, that the power and the legitimacy of this democracy, of this rule of power in Indonesia, is upheld not by the achievement of the government, but by silence the oppositions. So yeah, that is a very interesting insight. And then we will begin our Q&A session. So once again, I really encourage the participant in this Zoom meeting or in other social media platform, either it is a Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, to ask a question to both of our speakers today. But before that, I have several questions. Maybe first to Mr. Terry, to Terry. I really interested that when you mentioned that one of the aspects that make the U.S. democracy is decline because the election system looks like a rigged game. The game is rigged. So my question is that when you say that a good democracy is a democracy where there is a free and fair elections, I think many of the Americans already saw this, already saw that the electoral college system is not a very democratic in practice. So is there any response from the American citizen itself to ask the election in United States is using a popular vote like we do in Indonesia? Thank you.
yes, there is an attempt, and there has been an attempt ever since about year 2000 to have to get rid of the electoral system, the electoral college. However, in the East, it's very difficult to do. Why? Because we would have to amend the U.S. Constitution. And in order to amend the U.S. Constitution, you need 38 out of 50 states to pass the amendment. And you'll never get 38 states to pass that amendment. Why? Because the big states like Texas want the electoral college. Because the big states, we get 28 votes, okay? California gets 40 votes. So in other words, Florida, New York, those are the big four states. Those states, California basically would go along with getting rid of the electoral college because they're a lot more liberal. But the more conservative big states don't want to get rid of the electoral college. And that means that it's all our elections, our presidential elections, unfortunately, are a game. It's all gamesmanship. Okay, how can you get the majority of the people in Florida, for example, to vote for you? In other words, these presidential campaigns don't go to Wyoming. These people don't go to North Dakota, South Dakota. They don't go to those places. They are always in the big states, and you know, how did Biden win? Well, first, he campaigned heavily in Philadelphia and won Pennsylvania. Okay, that's another big state. So he won Pennsylvania. He lost in Florida. He won in California. He won in the Midwest, the upper Midwest, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan. He won in all of those. So in other words, and he won in Georgia, which was a real big surprise. And he won in Arizona. So in other words, all you have you don't need to win the other ones. So you can win 2 million more votes like Hillary did, 2 million more, and you can lose the election. So it is a ridiculous system, and it should be changed. There is a drive to have states sign a pact, and that pact, if we could just get a majority of states to sign that pact, then that would mean there are two states that do it very differently. Two states. They give their electoral vote proportionately. So, New Hampshire, they say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to give it proportionally. And Nebraska does the same thing. They say, well, if this person wins 60% of the vote, then we're going to give him 60% of our electoral college. If this person wins 70% of the vote, he gets 70 or she gets 70%. So if all states would do that, then we could get around this big game of the electoral college. And I wish I'd see it in my lifetime, but I kind of think I probably won't. The status quo likes being the status quo.
Okay, thank you, Terry. I really hope that you see in your lifetime, seriously. And interestingly, that in your presentation, you said that the most united country is a sign of a good democracy. And this is maybe a question for Mr. Abu Bakar Ebihara. If the good democracy will be also good implemented in the most united country, then what about Indonesia? Indonesia has a various ethnic group, has a many different culture, various religions, and how this democracy could apply a very good in Indonesia. Yes, we know that Indonesia already adopted, but maybe could be that the acceptance of democracy is in Indonesia is quite not very smooth because of this.
All right. Thank you. It's very good but difficult question to answer, actually. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I think this could be one problem there's one writing, for example, mentioned about a communitarian democracy system in Minangkabau, for example. They have their own style of democracy, their own deliberative kind of democracy in choosing the leaders, for example, in Nagari system or whatever over there. So the introduction of liberal democracy actually make them difficult because over there they have a kind of direct election. They don't need the representatives. They don't need a political parties, things like that. So they can elect the leaders directly, and then they can discuss problems in a kind of musawara, for example, for that. But introduction of liberal democracy, kind of making them difficult actually to make a decision because you have a representative, a political party, or things like that. So this is one thing. I mean, but in general, I think democracy is is one way. I think it's can unite Indonesia because I think this is hard to explain because sometimes we talk about Pancasila democracy, isn't it? So we are talking that so that's why I said we don't it is a kind of very, very long process of adopting. So we are struggling to understand, to implement democracy because according to government, for example, we have our own Pancasila democracy. So in Pancasila, there's been a religious principle over there. So while democracy, liberal democracy is based on secularisms, on differentiation between state and religion, but in Indonesia, as you know, it is you cannot differentiate, you cannot separate. I mean, religion and democracy. Yes, I mean, religion and states, something like that. So this is a problem actually, and it's been not settled until now. And democracy, as mentioned, is only accepted, I think, as a kind of electoral democracy. It's not the substance of democracy itself. And I think so. It's really back to your question. I think it's really, really difficult one to answer, but I believe that we need to struggle, we need to promote democracy because it has a very good principle over there. There is the principle of equality, so every groups can participate equally. Only the problem is that very difficult for people outside Java, for example, to win in the president election because of the number. Sometimes, I'm not sure when Indonesia will have a president from outside Java. So this is also another issue. So I don't have a clear answer for your question, but that's probably my unclear answer to your question.
Oh no, thank you, Mr. Abu Bakar. Is it quite clear? Yeah, especially that if you want to win election in Indonesia, win the vote of Java people. The Java is the key to win Indonesian election. All right. Once again, I really encourage the participants to ask a question you can type it directly in the Zoom chat feature, or you can ask the question via other social media platform, either it's a Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, because we also broadcast it live there. So there is another question. Actually, there is many questions that I have right now. The next question is from Tono Purwantoro, and I believe this is addressing to you, Mr. Terry. The question is that, thank you, Mr. Anderson. It's very interesting that you mentioned that Indonesia is in 52 in the in the democratic position in a country with a democracy system, Indonesia is in the 52. What is the indicator or what is the parameter that you can say that Indonesia in the 52 positions? And then his next question is that we know that in the 2020 election, Trump lost, and there is a response from Trump that he do not accept this loss. But also in 2019 election in Indonesia, when Mr. Prabowo is lost, he also first do not accept his loss. Do you think that there is a connection between these attitude, between there is a two candidate who do not accept his loss when he lost the election? Do you think there is a connection of these two attitudes? And yes, what is your response regarding this?
Yes, there is a similar attitude, of course, and that's the attitude of a person who is desperate and who wants to stay in power, regardless of what the election officials say. And in America, it was clear cut, very clear cut. We had Trump on the telephone and he was calling Georgia. I'm not making this up. He is calling the Secretary of State of Georgia, another Republican, and he's saying to him, would you just find me another 38,000 votes? Just find me a 38,000 votes so I can win your state. And the Secretary of State is recording this. He's recording it. He's a Republican. He's recording it. He's saying, this is preposterous, but I want to make sure that the American public as a whole understand the kinds of pressure that he's putting on me so he can try to stay in office. If he would have won Georgia or not, it wouldn't have made any difference because he lost Pennsylvania and many other states. So, but still, I mean, it is a man who is desperate, absolutely desperate. And this is what you get when you have somebody who does not believe in democracy. One of the things about Donald Trump that always surprised me, remember, he had never had a political position. He had never been elected before. He was only famous because he had his own television program, okay, The Apprentice. That's the only reason he was famous, and people liked that show. I saw it for 10 minutes and turned it off. I thought it was terrible. But anyway, the point is the man had never been elected and he did not know how democracy functioned. Okay, he didn't know how it worked, but he's an arrogant person who would not listen to his advisors. And he hired some pretty good people who tried to tell him 4-star Marine generals, you know, things like this. He would hire these people and these people would say, well, sir, we can't do this. We can't do that. And what happened? He'd fire them. Then he'd fire them. You know, if you're going to try to run a government that way, you know, you're going to be a disaster. And he was a disaster. Us historians have already voted on him. We voted on him. He's number 41 out of 45. So he's way down because he's one of our worst. Now, as far as the World Democracy Index, you can just Google the World Democracy Index and you can see that Indonesia comes up 52. Okay, and the United States comes up 24 or 25. What is the World Democracy Index? What are they looking at? What are the factors? Electoral process, pluralism, the functioning of the government. Is it functioning in the open or in the dark? Okay, the political participation. How many people actually go out and vote? Okay, the political culture. In other words, will people shout at each other or will they talk and listen to each other? And finally, the civil liberties. Those are the factors that the World Democracy Index uses.
Okay, thank you, Terry, for the answer. So, yes, a very, very insightful answer. So our Next question is from Yanti Rahmawati, and I believe this question, she or he do not write to which question this is asked, whether it's to Terry or to Mr. Abu Bakar. But I think you both can answer this question, because the question is said that some say freedom of speech is part of democracy. But what do you think about the ongoing trends of excessive fanatism, whether in politics, religion, etc.? People can easily put out on their social media, and I believe what they mean by put out on social media is their thought or what they think in social media, while in fact this could lead to intolerance and threat to democracy itself. So it's kind of a paradox that democracy is guarantee your freedom of speech, but what about when those freedom of speech can lead to intolerance? It could hurt the value of democracy itself. Maybe Mr. Abu Bakar, you will answer this very interesting question first.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, it's really interesting questions. I mean, I think freedoms, in my opinions, we have to freedom to do something, freedom to what? I think it's to be clear. So there's no freedom, such freedom to everything. I think. And also there is a limitation of freedom. So every country, I think, they have a regulation regarding the freedom. So it's very clear, particularly in country like Singapore, like Malaysia as well. They have a law to limit freedoms because they are afraid of the freedom can be used to instigate communal violence or things like that. I think in many countries they have this regulation. There's another thing, actually. People have to be wise in using freedom, because otherwise the freedom itself will be taken. I mean, if you are talk about something that is dangerous, democracy, you will destroy democracy itself. So it's the people who use freedom, so they should be wise. Otherwise, you don't have any more freedom, because later on everything is banned or everything is limited. So I think that's my opinion. So there's no such thing as freedom to freedom for freedom. I mean, just freedom to do something, and freedom, there's a limitation to freedom. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Abu Bakar. And what about your insight, Terry, about these questions?
This is a constant issue in democracy. Let me tell you about our very first important election in the United States. It was 1800. And if you go back and you read the newspapers and what they had to say about Thomas Jefferson, who wrote our Declaration of Independence, and you see the vile, horrible things they're saying. They're calling him a revolutionary. They're calling him all kinds of words. You just can't believe it. So this is in America's bloodstream. All democracies have this issue. What I would like to say is that it has now been amplified. I'm writing a book on the 1990s right now, and one of the big things that happened in the 1990s was the digital revolution, the rise of cyberspace, what we are doing right now, talking on this platform. All of this came out in the 1990s, and so did Facebook, and so by 2000. And so all of these social medias came out, and what did they do? They amplified all of this kind of speech. And therefore, what happened is Zuckerman and other people had to restrict some of these. Do you realize that Donald Trump has been restricted? He's been kicked off of Twitter. He's been kicked off of Facebook. Do you realize that? Because he continually made all of these statements, one lie after another. And you know, this is going to damage democracy in the long run. We have to get used to this new technology. We have to understand that everything you read in cyberspace isn't true.
Okay, thank you, Terry. Yes, not everything that you read in this cyberspace is true. Yes, that's why the digital literacy is important. All right, so our next question is from Dennis Tilar, and we invite Dennis Tilar to open his camera and mic to ask the question directly. Dennis Tilar, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so my question is directed to you actually, Mr. Terry Anderson. So earlier you mentioned about strongmen like Viktor Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, and more recently, Trump in the USA, and their negative effects on their respective democracies. However, we have to admit that these strongmen rise not without reasons. They are, in a way, still chosen by the people. And some of them think that they are a representation, a manifestation, if you indeed, of the people sidelined by and a symbol of opposition against the establishment. And indeed, some of them do think that the system is mistreating them by this continued alienation or even ostracism of populist leaders. Therefore, some argue that the rise of strongmen is a reaction of the corrupt system or establishment, or as former President Barack Obama said himself, I don't know if this is actually his quote or not, but I heard him saying that Trump is not the cause. Trump is a symptom. What's your take on this? Thank you very much.
I agree with that. I agree with that very much. Yes, there are a lot of things wrong, Dennis. There's a lot of things wrong with the United States. And during the last, ever since Ronald Reagan, during the last 40 years, we have seen more wealth concentrated in 1 or 2% of this country, and more people who are working class people who resent. They see these people driving around in their Teslas or their Mercedes Benz, and they resent this, and because they can't get ahead. And there's something else that a lot of white men, especially young white men that are trying, these are mostly people who are not college educated. These are mostly people who feel that the American dream is really a dream and not a reality for them. There's no way that they can get ahead. Okay, and there was something else that happened in the 60s and 70s that fed this resentment, and that was civil rights. Now all of a sudden African Americans are getting jobs instead of this white person. Okay, and another thing, a thing that had a tremendous impact on my country and the world, and that's women's liberation. Now all of these women are getting jobs, and here I am, and I'm not getting one, and I'm terribly resentful about that. So I think that the people who are the elites are only helping those African Americans, and they're only helping those women, and they're not helping me. So there's a lot of resentment in America. And of course, those people are going to vote for somebody that they think is the underdog, Trump. He was not supposed to win in 2016. He won the Electoral College, but all of the surveys before said that he was going to lose by 10 percentage points. Okay, all of them were wrong. They were all wrong. But that's another reason why we had so many people go out and vote in 2020. We set records on the number of people showing up to vote. Okay, and the polls were a little off in 2022. But yes, Trump was created by the resentment of a large group of American people, 45% of the American people who feel that Somebody else is getting all of the fruits of the labor that they are doing.
Okay, thank you for the response, Mr. Terry. I hope that is quite answering your question, Dennis Tilar. Thank you for the question. So our next question is asked to Mr. Abu Bakar. So the question is from Anita Afriani Sinulinga. The question is, what is your opinion about a various type of democracy that have been implemented in Indonesia since President Sukarno until President Jokowi? This democratic practice that implemented from these various presidents is take an insight or have a local value from Indonesia in it. What is your answer to this question, Mr. Abu Bakar? Thank you.
All right, thank you for the questions. I think it's also a difficult question. I think it's a good but difficult one as well. I think it is not local values. I think that is problematic. I mean, but what we see is that's why I mentioned in my presentation, I try to explain that it's not an easy one, although people have formulated a kind of standard of democracy, and they use it to measure, like mentioned before, that we are number 52, for example. But the issue is not as simple as that. There has been a kind of difficult process, I think, to understand democracy, to discuss democracy. I mean, yes, one example, as I mentioned, they understand power. For example, power is not used to deliver people needs, but they feel insecure with the power. So what they do is to increase the power by silencing the opposition, by increasing the power, by limiting the opposition. So they want as many power as possible. So instead of addressing people's needs, so they are increasing whatever they can do to increase the power. So that's just one way they understand the power. So it's not like they understand in the Western concept of democracy. So democracy is one way to have a legitimate power. So by legitimation, actually, you can fulfill the interest of the people. So that is the meaning of democracy. So here, the meaning has been given different meanings. So it is not the local values, but it is, I think, the way that I think the governments or the elites understand democracy. That's why then we need the opposition, we need the activists to remind the people, to remind the government to do the right things, and in democracy. I mean, that's why people protest against the weakening of KPK or things like that. I think it is not about local values, but it is about the behavior of the politician itself. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for the answer, Mr. Abu Bakar Ebihara. So then we move to our next question, and I believe that the next question will be asked directly by Rifki Darmawan. Rifki Darmawan, are you there? You can ask your question directly. Please turn on your camera and unmute yourself. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Rima. My name is Rifki, and thank you very much for the presentation. I think it's very insightful from Dr. Terry and also Pak Ebihara. So my questions is about in regards to the U.S. who did export the value of democracy to many different parts of the world. And I actually already typed in the chat box my question to Dr. Terry. So as we can see from Dr. Terry's presentation that there have been so many attempts by the US government try to bring the democratic values to many regions. Some of them resulted in in success, but some the others seems to be like a failure for the United States. So my question is about is there what sense of urgency that actually push the United States government to do this kind of thing, try to export the value of democracy in many parts of the world, because we know that this is not an easy thing to do. It costs many lives sometimes, and also it costs a lot, especially for the U.S. government. U.S. need to spend a lot of money, spend a lot of things, try to spread the value of democracy all over the world. So that's my question. Is there any specific thing that somehow push the U.S. to do this? Thank you, Dr. Sagi.
First, I'd like to say that all empires try to push their type of government onto their colonies. The French, the British, the Americans, they all try to do this. One of the reasons they do it is domestic politics. In other words, it sells, it gets votes at home. We, for years, have tried to get Cuba to become like us. It's not going to work. I've been to Cuba twice. It's a very interesting and a fun place to go. But anyway, we are always trying to do it. We are trying to get other countries to look like us all the time. Because if you want to be a politician, you go out and tell the American people, we have the best government in the world, and everybody should be like us. Now, if you went out and you said, our government really, our democracy is really flawed, you're not going to win votes. You're not going to get elected. So much of this is for domestic consumption. Okay, it certainly was in Vietnam. Oh, huge. I mean, we are going to try to get Vietnam, a place I've been to 3 times and really enjoy it. We are going to get Vietnam to accept our culture. Well, it's a stupid assumption to begin with. But LBJ knew that if he didn't try to do that, and if the communist government took over, then he would be skewered. He would be just absolutely killed politically at home. So he continued this and continued it and continued it and continued it until the American people said, stop, enough, we don't care, let it be communist, and then we got out. So it's domestic consumption.
Okay, thank you for the answer, Mr. Terry. I hope that answered your question, Rifki. All right, and then we move to our next question, and I believe that Dafa Arkan want to ask a question directly. So please, Dafa, turn on your camera and unmute your mic.
Hello. Can I use Bahasa to this question? Because my English so freaking bad.
It's all right. It's all right. You can try to use in English first, and maybe if not very clear, and I will repeat the question again.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bima. Sebelumnya terima kasih pada Pak Ubakar dan Mr. Sari. I want to ask to Mr. Terry Anderson about Trump loss in electoral vote in last year. It is caused by pandemic that affect the democratic practice that make the relationship of trust between people and state decline. Saya ingin menanyakan tentang kekalahan Trump di electoral vote tahun kemarin kepada Mr. Anderson. Apakah ini diakibatkan pandemi yang mempengaruhi praktik demokrasi, membuat hubungan kepercayaan antara masyarakat dan negara menjadi turun? Sekian, terima kasih.
Okay, thank you, Dafa. So let me translate it to you, Mr. Terry. So Dafa want to ask that there is a connection between the Trump lost the previous election in 2020. Is there is a relation between his loss and the pandemic situation that happened in United States? The pandemic situation make the relation of trust between the citizens and states is decline. What is your take? What is your insight about this question? Thank you.
Yeah, yes, there is a relationship between the pandemic and Trump's loss. Because how did Trump respond to the pandemic? The pandemic starts in China in December. In January, Trump is already calling it the Chinese flu. He's making fun of it. He's saying it's no worse than the flu. On and on, one excuse after another. It takes him until May 15th to declare Operation Warp Speed. So from January to May, he loses time. In May 15th, he declares warp speed. In other words, we're going to get a vaccine. And the vaccine comes out about January of this year. If he would have started immediately, and if he would have been vaccinating people by October or November, he might have won the election. But instead, he kept blaming other people for it. He would not listen to his own medical advisors. He gets the COVID virus himself, okay? And so he would not listen to him. He's making fun while Americans are dying. So the pandemic hurt him politically.
Okay, thank you for the answer, Mr. Terry. Yeah, so there is a connection between the pandemic situation and why the Trump lost in the previous election. And finally, I, as a moderator, want to apologize to all of the participants that is asked a question, but yet to be read, or I will read the question because we are limited in time. So there is still many questions that want to be asked to you, Mr. Terry, and you, Mr. Abu Bakar. But once again, time is limited us. But once again, yes, a very, very fruitful discussion, very many interesting questions, and a very good insight, a good take about democracy, both from you, both from Mr. Terry and both from Mr. Abu Bakar. Once again, I, as a moderator, said thank you for your time. And then let me close this Q&A sessions with this. Essentially, democracy is a flow, but there is a flaw. There is a flaws in democracy. Yes, democracy have its weakness, but remember, one of the main purpose of democracy is to eliminate the tyrant ruler, because there is a power given to the people. To eliminate, there is no evil leader that will lead those people. And then I will close this Q&A session with this. If you feel that you've been ruled by a tyrant, maybe you not in a democracy systems. I'm Bima Jonanda as a moderator you for today. I will give it back to James. And once again, thank you for Mr. Terry, thank you for Mr. Abu Bakar, and thank you for all the participants. Back to you, James.
Right. Thank you so much to our speakers for today, Professor Terry and Professor Abu Bakar, along with our moderator, Mas Bima, for today's very informative session. It's been great having you guys with us. Earlier in the event, we asked our audience members a question: which civilization of the ancient world first created democracy? And the correct answer to that is option C, Greece. Democracy was first created by the ancient Greeks around the 5th century BCE, and the word comes from two Greek words, demos, which means people, and kratos, which means rule. Shout out goes to Nadia Chayadi from Instagram for answering correctly. And thank you to everyone who has participated. Don't forget to tune in next time for another chance to get a shout out from us. Now you may be wondering, how could I develop an awesome idea for a place like this? It's very easy. All you need to do is go to our website at www.atamerica.or.id, select create a program and click collaborate with us. All event proposals coming to us will be reviewed and your event might be featured here soon. You can also subscribe to our newsletter for all our weekly updates. And that wraps this episode. I would also like to remind everyone that earlier in the event, we mentioned handing out Apple EarPods. For further information on how to get them, you can visit our link at atam.tv/US Connected for more information. All right, again, thank you everyone for joining. My name is James, and we'll see you again at the next At America TV episode. Goodbye.
Bye.